Thank you so much. I'm honored to join you. Very honored to join you. Well, I am the guy that also wrote an additional book that wasn't mentioned. It was just released a month ago. It's called Not a Daycare: The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth. And this is the result of the op-ed that I wrote some 2 years ago that I talked to you about last year at this specific conference in this specific room. And I want to repeat that story to you, and I'm going to challenge you with a bit of a different message today. And that message is this: are Christians too political? Are Christians too political? We live in a time where many of us in this room are accused of that, not necessarily by the secular world or the pagan or the atheist, but we're accused of that by our own churches. We're accused of that from inside as much, if not more so, from outside. So again, class, I've said this before. I'm not a preacher, I'm a teacher. We're going to go to school this morning, okay? So pay attention, pay attention. We're going to have a quiz at the end of this lesson, and if you pass it, I may give you some college credit. But you have to pay me about $500 a credit hour to get it, okay? All right, the story, the context. A couple years ago, I wrote an op-ed, and I challenged the snowflake rebellion. I challenged this idea of trigger warnings and microaggressions and safe spaces that's prevailing across our college campuses from East Coast to West Coast, from Berkeley to Brown. I challenged it, and I said at the end of it, if you expect to be coddled rather than confronted, if you expect to be comforted rather than to have your character challenged at my university, you might want to go someplace else, maybe the University of Missouri. And I concluded by saying, my land, this is a university, it's not a daycare. This is a university, it's not a daycare. And as the result of that simple message that was written in a local newspaper op-ed, which generally has about 5 people reading it and 3 people caring, somehow Glenn Beck got a hold of that particular piece. And by the end of a couple weeks, 3.5 million people had read it on Fox and Friends, and CBS, and ABC, and NBC Today, and Drudge, and Dreher, and Limbaugh, and Beck, and the list goes on and on. Even newspapers in the Orient and in Oxford, England, carried the story. All of a sudden, people cared because I confronted the lunacy of safe spaces, and I presented the wisdom of common sense. I confronted the idiocy of microaggressions with a message of morality. I said that education should not be about what is common, as in Common Core, but rather what is excellent, and that there's more about a good education than acquiring information, but rather it's about ethics. That it's not about just getting a career, but it's rather about building character, and that education, the best education, is not just about money, but rather about morality. I've said that if you want to be coddled rather than confronted, and if you want to feel comfortable in your selfishness rather than confronted of your sin, that you might want to go to a different place. Again, my message was, this is not a daycare, it's a university. So the result, millions of people have followed it. And the book, Not a Daycare: The Devastating Consequences of Abandoning Truth, has been a bestseller in Amazon.com in 3 different categories. Little shameless self-promotion. You can buy one after this speech. I'll be signing books at noon. Enough of that. Let's move forward, class. So why do people care? Well, we did a statistical analysis internally of the comments. And 97% of the comments of these 3.5 million people that read that initial op-ed, and by the way, the story has been exposed to over 30 million people via the national media since. 97% of the comments in our statistical analysis were positive, and 3% were negative. Who is the positive? Here's the poster child. The positive comes from a major university in the South, a state university. I won't mention it by name. I don't want to get the guy in trouble. But I received a hard-copied letter from a gentleman who said this: Dr. Piper, I read your Not a Daycare piece, period. I went to your website to figure out who you are, period. As an atheist, I can easily dismiss your religion and your politics, period. And I do. But on this issue, thank you, kudos, please carry on. It needed to be said. Signed, Fulbright Scholar, Psychology Department of the University XYZ. This is the atheist. This is the secularist that recognizes, good for you, it needed to be said, please carry on. Now, who represents the 3%? of the negative? The church. I'm not kidding. The 3% comes from the church. The church is emailing me and texting me and calling me and saying, shame on you. You made the kid feel uncomfortable. You hurt his feelings. But the secularist is recognizing we created this monster. It's our fault. The academic community, my industry, the colleges and universities, the ivory tower created this monster. It's turning around to bite us. It's consuming us, and it's frightening. What do? They're saying good for you, but the church says shame on you. Well, here's my message to you this morning. Basically, the church is saying you're too political. Christians are too political. Conservative Christians, in particular, are too political. That's not the gospel. That's not the message of Scripture, to be political. Stop it. Stop it. Well, here's my response. And I'm going to stay on script on this. I want to read this for you because I want you to hear it. It's the meat of my message. As a university president, I am an educator, and I believe it's my obligation to educate. The historical role of the college president is to teach not only his students, but also his community what it means to be a thoughtful and engaged lifelong learner. My view is that it would be antithetical to my call as a Christian scholar and a community leader to remain silent in the face of the most critical issues of our time, such as the definition of human life, the definition of a human being, the sanctity of marriage, and the dignity of women. Orange Scott and Luther Lee, Orange Scott, a very unusual name, and Luther Lee were the founders of my church, the Wesleyan Church, and they were not silent as they fought against one of the most politically volatile issues in the history of our nation. They fought for the dignity of blacks and human equality. They fought against they fought against slavery, which led to the Civil War. My church was born out of political engagement because its founders recognized that the definition of the human being was in question. William Wilberforce was not silent as he worked for over 20 years on the floor of the British Parliament to abolish the British slave trade. John Wesley, I'm a Wesleyan, was not silent when he admonished Wilberforce to never give up in the fight for biblical justice. By the way, there's a difference between social justice and biblical justice. Justice is defined by the Bible. It's not defined by your society or your culture or you or me. For there to be justice, there has to be a judge with a capital J. There is no justice. There is no justice if you define it rather than God. Our church is built on the foundation of those who recognize their obligation to be salt and light to a broken culture and a hurting world, to be an outspoken voice for a biblical worldview, to practice wisdom in the public square. My Wesleyan church was founded upon such a voice and upon such conviction. What continues to amaze me is the persistent claim from inside the evangelical community that the commentary of people like Jim Garlow and Eric Metaxas and Franklin Graham and other conservative thinkers and leaders who argue for traditional morality and the merits of a biblical worldview, arguing that this is too political. Who decided that defending the identity and the dignity of a woman is political? Who decided that defending the lives of our youngest children is too political? Who decided that defending marriage, a historic sacrament of the church, my land, not a function of the state, is too political? Who decided that fighting for the rights of a bunch of nuns called the Little Sisters of the Poor is too political? Sidebar, they're nuns. They're celibate. They don't need contraception and they won't use it. Talk about misogyny, talk about condescension, talk about arrogance of anyone in this room or in the federal government, a bureaucrat, anywhere, in the church or in and administration to suggest that women are too stupid to know what kind of health care products they want to buy in their health care. Who decided that teaching biology, that the female is a fact, not a fantasy, and not a social construct? Who decided that teaching that women are real, not a fantasy, not a delusion of a dysphoric male? Who decided that that's too political? Who decided that these issues were political rather than biblical? My goodness, one would have to wonder if my detractors would have tried to silence Orange Scott and Luther Lee, who led the fight against slavery, because it was too political. Sidebar, as I suggested, at Oklahoma Wesleyan University, we actually do believe that women are real. We believe that they have the right to their own sport and their own locker room, their own scholarships, and their own showers. We believe in women's athletics. We believe in Title IX. And I would suggest that if any male can raise his hand on a given day and say, I am a woman, that women's athletics and Title IX is dead. And in fact, I suggested that to the federal government when they sent me a letter a couple years ago from the DOE and the OCR demanding that I start providing transgender accommodations on my campus under the auspices of Title IX. They said, now, because of Title IX demanding gender equality, you have to provide transgender accommodations. I responded and said, excuse me. Title IX demands that I give women equal access to the athletic field and facilities. I'd like to ask you, Mr. Bureaucrat, how can I give women equal access to anything if I now deny that they exist? We received a response back saying essentially this: okay, you've got an exemption. Too political. Folks, you're going to be challenged that because you're here today, that you're too political. You're going to be challenged not necessarily just from the secular world. I'm going to suggest that you're being challenged more so from inside the sacred world. The church is challenging you and arguing that you're too political. That by defending the unborn, you're too political. By defending the woman, you're too political. That by defending human identity and human dignity, you're too political. That by suggesting that the human being is the imago Dei, the image of God, that you're not the imago dog. You're not defined by your inclinations and your appetites. You're defined by a moral standard that's imprinted upon the human soul. You're defined by those self-evident truths that are endowed to you by your Creator. You have the ability and the moral culpability to recognize what is right and wrong, and your sinful inclinations do not define you. That is not political. That is biblical. That is principled. And don't let anyone tell you differently. Dietrich Bonhoeffer said this, and you know this: not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. That is my challenge to you this morning. Not to speak is to speak, and not to act is to act. Silence in the face of evil is evil itself. God will not hold us guiltless. We are obligated to be salt to a rotting culture. We are obligated to be light to a dark world. We are obligated to take the truth of Christ and the truth of Scripture to a culture, to a community, to a country, and to a church that desperately needs to hear that truth is an objective reality. It's not a social construct. In conclusion, there's a solution, and it's simple. I'm an optimist, and so should you be. I know the end of the story. We win. The solution to this madness is clear. It is intellectual freedom rather than ideological fascism. Do you understand what I'm saying? As a conservative, as a person who believes in conserving the time-tested truths of God, as a person who believes in conservation, I believe in clean air and clean water. I believe in saving a whale and an owl in a tree once in a while. I'm a conservationist, and so are you. But do you realize that as conservatives, as conservationists, you're more classically liberal than your left-of-center counterpart? Do you get that? You're the liberals today because you believe in liberty and liberation. You believe in freedom. You believe in justice. You believe in intellectual and academic freedom on the college campus rather than the ideological fascism that's prevailing today. So the solution is this: stand for intellectual freedom and fight ideological fascism. Stand for facts as the goal of the academy, not feelings. Stand for truth versus opinions. At Oklahoma Wesleyan University, when you graduate, let's pretend we're students in the last 3 minutes of my speech here. You are my students today. You have been students at Oklahoma Wesleyan University for the past 4 years. You're graduating today. Today is commencement day. You're sitting in the audience in your funny cap and gown, and I am standing up here giving you a commencement address in mine. Now, I've spoken for way too long. It's been a boring commencement address. You're not here to listen to me. You're here to graduate. I'm done. Now, students, come forward. You're going to stand to my left, your right. You're going to march across the stage when your name is called. I'm going to shake your hand and pat you on the back, and I'm going to whisper in your ear, "Congratulations, you now have a degree in opinions." That's absurd. I hope you learned something after studying at my university. I hope you learned what's true and right and just and real. I hope you learned, if you're a nurse, not to administer medication to me on the basis of your opinion. I hope you learned, if you're going to design airplanes as an engineer, not to design them on the basis of your opinion. Because if you did, tell me which one it is. I need to get home, and I don't want to get on that airplane. Here's the moral of the story, students. Today you're graduating because you learned something that was real. You learned something that was right. You learned something that was true. I don't care what your opinion is today. And students, you shouldn't care that much about my opinion, because here's the deal. Opinions always lead to bondage and slavery. Opinions always lead to fascism rather than freedom. Pol Pot had an opinion, and Mao had an opinion, and Robespierre had an opinion, and Chavez and Hitler and Mussolini, and all the despots of history had opinions. And guess what? It didn't end well, did it? But here's the deal. When you come forward to get your diploma, I want you to remember this one thing. Jesus told you, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free." Thank you. Thank you.